In the early morning hours after the news broke, the corridors of the Vatican were quieter than usual. The air seemed denser, as though centuries of sacred breath had been exhaled at once and not yet replaced. Candles burned steadily in small chapels tucked between marble columns, but no one knelt before them. Priests passed one another without words, their cassocks brushing stone floors in uneasy rhythm. Something had shifted, not just in the hierarchy, but in the invisible realm above and within it. The chair of Peter was empty again, but it was not the vacancy that disturbed those who understood. Rather, it was the silence that followed. For decades, there had been whispers, visions, and letters sealed too long. Padre Pio had once spoken carefully about a time when the church would lose not its buildings, but its voice. He had seen a vision of altars left intact, candles lit, rituals performed, but without fire, without presence. Not a persecution from outside, but a hollowing out from within. He warned of this moment not in thunder, but in trembling phrases recorded by only the most trusted ears. "When the shepherd is struck," he had once said, "many will not run. They will stay, but fall asleep." Now the silence inside the basilica mirrored that prophecy. Not the solemn silence of adoration, but the stunned absence of direction. Confusion spread like incense without wind, curling and settling into every corner of the church's spiritual life. Decisions were paused, statements delayed, homilies became general, uncertain, sanitized. And the people, some wept, some argued, but many simply drifted away, slowly, imperceptibly, as if the magnetic center had shifted and no one had noticed. Lucia, the seer from Fatima, had once spoken of a time of spiritual anesthesia, a moment when many would no longer recognize the sound of the Good Shepherd's voice. She spoke of it not with anger, but with sorrow, and only to those who still believed that silence could carry truth. That silence had come. It wrapped itself around liturgies, confessions, theological debates, even acts of charity. Everything continued, but with a strange hollowness, a ritual repetition unmoored from the burning center. The news agencies called it a moment of transition, but the mystics knew better. It was a fulfillment. Padre Pio's letters, once dismissed as obscure, spiritual metaphors, had spoken of a storm hidden beneath calm skies. When the sun is shining and the bells still ring, that will be the time to listen closely, for it is not the sound of celebration, but of retreat, he had written. And now, as spring arrived in Rome, the bells still rang, and the sun still warmed the cobblestones, but within, the walls of the church absorbed a silence deeper than night. In monasteries across Europe, some began to fast without being asked. Others took up night vigils, not because of a calendar, but because something in their hearts stirred with warning. In cloisters and convents, there were dreams of flickering lights, of open tabernacles with no presence within. The faithful were not panicking, they were waking up. And in that awakening, they sensed the enormity of the silence now hanging beneath the domes and arches. Not merely because Francis was gone, but because something spiritual had been severed, or perhaps exposed. Something Padre Pio had seen, something Lucia had wept over, something no one wanted to name. And so, the silence under the vaults was not a pause between popes. It was the beginning of something prophesied, something now unfolding, not outside the church, but from within it. Lucia of Fatima had lived much of her life beneath the veil of silence. To the world, she was a cloistered nun, peaceful, obedient, hidden from view. But within the quiet stone walls of her Carmelite cell, she carried something the church was never ready to hear in full. Not all of her visions had been published. Not all had been received. Some remained locked in private letters and guarded conversations, concealed not from a lack of faith, but from fear of what they might ignite. In the years following the death of Pope John Paul II, something shifted in her presence. Sisters who lived beside her began to notice a quiet urgency in her prayers and a trembling intensity when the subject of the Church's future was mentioned. She had seen what was coming, and she had written about it, but only those closest to her knew how deeply it troubled her spirit. Among the few confidants who had earned her trust, there were whispered references to the smoke entering the sanctuary, to a white figure who leads, yet is not seen, and to a great silence that would cover Rome before the breaking. Lucia never named dates, she never uttered accusations, but her language was heavy with prophetic weight. She spoke once of a time when a spiritual vacuum would overtake the heart of the Church, not by external force, but by erosion from within, when the shepherds would be confused, the faithful scattered, and many would lose the sense of who Christ truly is. She said there would be a mourning unlike any other, one that would come not after violence, but after replacement, the substitution of the sacred with the efficient, of the holy with the tolerable. Her spiritual director, long after her passing, recalled one confession where Lucia broke down in tears, not from personal grief, but from a vision that continued to haunt her. A church stripped of reverence, a sanctuary emptied of presence, and above all, a figure clothed in white walking through crumbling stone, unrecognized by those around him. She feared that this vision, kept locked away for decades, would only be understood when it was too late. When the last echo of Petrine authority had faded not by attack, but by apathy, as the world watched Pope Francis's health decline and then, suddenly his passing, some within the Church began to whisper again of Lucia's sealed words. The vision was not only of collapse but of replacement, of a new voice rising from the ruins, carrying not the cross but something more ambiguous, an invitation without conversion, mercy without truth. She had seen the Church not persecuted but reimagined, and in that reimagining she saw the danger of forgetting the cross entirely. The silence around Lucia's final writings became a source of tension. A few believed that hidden within the archives of the Vatican was a sealed letter, one which described with startling accuracy the days now unfolding. Others dismissed it as myth, a legend woven by those longing for clarity amid chaos. But the signs she once wept over now stood in plain sight. The empty tabernacles, the liturgies drained of reverence, the homilies filled with humanism yet devoid of the divine. Lucia had always warned that the greatest deception would not come from outside the Church, but from within. And now, after Francis's death, that warning echoed with chilling clarity. The shepherd was gone, the flock still wandered, and the vision that once trembled in silence now cried out for understanding. Inside the corridors of the church, where incense once floated like silent prayers and the echo of chants carried through marble naves, something was breaking. But the break wasn't visible to the naked eye. It didn't come with fire or protest. It came with a whisper, a shifting of intentions, a soft surrender of reverence. Long before the world heard the announcement Francis is gone, Lucia had already felt the trembling within. And Padre Pio, in his final years, had warned those closest to him not of external persecutions, but of an unraveling from within. A spiritual erosion masked by institutional confidence. The collapse did not start at the altar, but in the heart. Seminarians once formed in silence and obedience now debated doctrine as if it were theory. Confessionals grew quiet. The Eucharist, once approached with trembling awe, began to lose its centrality, replaced by spectacle, sentiment, and in some places, ideological compromise. The people still came. The candles still burned. But beneath the liturgy, there was a growing emptiness. And the faithful, though they could not name it, felt it. A numbness of the soul. Lucia had written of this silently. in letters that the Vatican stored but did not release in full. Her visions, while gentle in tone, struck with prophetic force. She saw altars stripped, tabernacles moved aside, and churches filled not with repentance but distraction. She wrote of priests who no longer believed but still performed their duties, like actors reciting forgotten lines. She saw the lambs scattered because the shepherds had grown tired, not of persecution, but of conviction. The message was always clear. Without fidelity to truth, even the most sacred walls begin to crumble. Padre Pio's prophecies echoed this decline. In his own monastery, he grew more silent with age, often whispering warnings to his brothers. He spoke of a church that would outwardly appear strong, but inwardly decay. "There will come a time," he said, "when the smoke of confusion will enter the sanctuary." And though his words were written off as mystical dramatism, time proved him right. Liturgical innovation became a shield for spiritual dilution. Clarity was exchanged for inclusivity. Mercy was preached, but the call to conversion grew faint. The collapse wasn't about politics or hierarchy, it was the soul of the church being hollowed out. And those who sensed it most deeply were not the theologians but the simple faithful, the ones who knelt in the back pews with broken rosaries, the old women who still prayed in Latin, the youth searching for meaning in silence, not slogans. They didn't leave the church, but the church in many ways had left them. Or rather, had left behind the stillness where God speaks. As the world reeled from the news of Francis' passing, many expected chaos from the outside. But the storm had long been gathering within. Lucia's silence now spoke louder than any papal proclamation. And Padre Pio's blood, those wounds that bled during Holy Week, stood as a testimony that Christ suffers again not from the blows of enemies, but from the indifference of his own house. In monasteries the bells still rang, but their sound was now a question, not an answer. In Rome, the cardinals gathered, but the Spirit seemed far away. And across the world, in tiny chapels and kitchen tables, the faithful turned to the saints, not for doctrine, but for discernment. For somewhere deep down, they knew. This collapse was not the end. It was the shaking before a greater awakening. But only if the Church remembered who she was. Only if she returned, not to relevance, but to reverence, under a grey sky that mirrored the heaviness in her chest. Sister Lucia often walked the grounds of her Carmelite convent with slow, deliberate steps. Her prayers were no longer soft intercessions, but silent groanings of the soul, pressed beneath the weight of things she had seen and never been allowed to fully speak. Among the sisters, she was known as devout, obedient, hidden. But within, she carried something else, something terrifying and radiant. A vision not meant for her alone, but one she was told the world might not be ready to bear. What Lucia had been shown in the blinding clarity of her early encounters with the Virgin did not fade with age. It deepened. But the world changed. And as the Church grew more careful, more diplomatic, and more politically aligned, the seer of Fatima was increasingly kept at a distance from microphones and questions. The third part of the secret had been released, or so they said. But Lucia remained unconvinced that the world had understood. Or perhaps, she feared, the world had simply chosen to look away. It wasn't just what she had seen. It was what she hadn't been allowed to say. A silence pressed on her from both the spiritual realm and the ecclesiastical. Letters she had written, never published. Warnings she had offered, filtered through layers of interpretation. The sorrow of it all etched lines into her face deeper than time could account for. She was the last living witness of something heaven had desperately wanted to reveal. And yet, decades later, when she heard that Pope Francis had passed into eternity, she did not weep as others did. She bowed her head, not in grief but in recognition. In her final years, Lucia had taken to writing prayers she never shared, notes tucked inside the margins of her breviary. In them were phrases that now feel less like prayers and more like prophecy. The shepherd will be struck, and the sheep will scatter. When the voice of Peter falls silent, the wolves will circle the fold. They will exchange the light for language. Her spiritual director dismissed them as poetic expressions, but those who later uncovered them after her death found chills tracing their spines. She had once asked, in a private conversation with a visiting cleric, if a time would come when the church would still stand, but not shine, not visibly, that its light would be obscured, not by persecution from without, but a strange dullness from within. He didn't understand her then. He had smiled politely. Now, in the shadow of a papal funeral, her words returned like an echo through the corridors of a splintering sanctuary. The faithful were beginning to feel it, a disquiet not born from headlines or controversies, but from an invisible withdrawal of something sacred. A sense that the altar still stood, the sacraments were still celebrated, but the presence was retreating. Lucia had seen this in a single flash years ago, when she had been shown a church half-lit where even the angels averted their eyes. That phrase had been found written on the back of a worn prayer card she carried. Those closest to her in the final month said she rarely spoke aloud, but when she did, she asked only that people return to silence. In silence, we will hear what has already begun, she had said. And those who now listened to the emptiness left in the wake of Pope Francis's passing might begin to understand what she meant. Not a collapse of doctrine, not fire and brimstone, but a spiritual evacuation, a throne left intact but no longer burning. The silence Lucia kept was not weakness, it was reverence. Reverence for a message so piercing that only stillness could hold it. And now, as the church finds itself disoriented by change, confused by contradiction, and wounded by its own shepherd's departure, Lucia's silent vision begins to make a terrible kind of sense. The vision was not only of what was to come, but of what would be ignored. And now, with the voice of the prophet long gone, only the silence remains. All across the world, chapels flickered with the last glow of candlelight. The sacred silence of a church that once roared with clarity had now dimmed to uncertain echoes. But within this deepening twilight, not all lights had gone out. Some remained, small, flickering, hidden in convents, monasteries, and the hearts of those still kneeling. Lucia had once said that in the final hour, the fight would not be of swords or thrones, but of altars. And Padre Pio knew this war had already begun. In the solitude of her Carmelite cell, Sister Lucia had written her final reflections in slow, aching script. She spoke not of visions with trumpets and fire, but of a quiet distortion, the kind that creeps in as kindness, as modernization, as progress. She wrote of shepherds who had once protected their flock, now scattering them through omissions and empty reassurances. Her warnings were not shouted but whispered between rosary beads and tears. She saw with piercing clarity the battle lines, drawn not on paper but in souls. Padre Pio, too, sensed the tremor beneath the marble. For years he had spoken of the internal erosion, a phrase he used sparingly but with unmistakable weight. The greatest threat to the church, he believed, would never come from violent persecution or external hatred. It would come dressed as mercy without truth, unity without doctrine, compassion severed from sacrifice. In his final confessions and letters, he warned that a time would come when even the elect would grow weary and confused, when many would mistake the dimming of the sanctuary lamp for a new kind of light. When Francis was gone, that moment arrived. The void left by his passing had not been filled with repentance or renewal. Instead, silence became doctrine. Ambiguity took the place of dogma, and the altar itself, once the site of Calvary renewed, was now treated in many places as performance. And yet, in this very moment of spiritual collapse, the final guardians began to rise. Not in Rome, not in the headlines, but in the hidden folds of faith. A young seminarian who refused to change the words of the consecration, a grandmother in Portugal who prayed the full rosary at dawn for priests she had never met, a lay brother sweeping the floor of an empty chapel with tears in his eyes because he knew he was still there, even if the world had stopped looking. Padre Pio and Lucia, though separated by distance and time, had always been connected by one truth. The Church would not fall by force, but by forgetting. And so their final acts were not declarations of power, but calls to remembrance. Pio clung to the Eucharist with trembling hands until the day he could no longer stand. Lucia, nearly blind, still traced the crucifix each morning on her chest, as if signing the Church back into her soul. Now, as the final battle unfolds, not with dramatic events, but through the erosion of reverence, those who have eyes to see must choose, not with banners, but with silence before the tabernacle, not with declarations, but with confession, not with outrage, but with intercession. The Church, stripped and weary, awaits its resurrection, but the vigil begins with those few who still watch in the dark. These are the guardians of light, and their battle is not yet over.